From the nation's capital in Washington, D.C., Cole on Congress. The program discussing national issues that affect Oklahoma. Your host, U.S. Representative Tom Cole.
Thank you for joining me today for another episode of Cole on Congress. Today I'm pleased to welcome Congressman Steve Pearce as our special guest. Steve represents southern New Mexico's 2nd Congressional District. He's a small business owner and a decorated Vietnam veteran who was recently elected to his 4th term in Congress. Steve, thanks for joining me today. It's really good to have you.
Nice to be here.
Now, I used to like to begin these things with something personal. Saying you were elected to your 4th term in Congress really sort of covers up an unusual political journey that you've been on. Steve and I were first elected together in 2002. We're classmates. After 3 terms, he decided he would make a bid for the United States Senate. That was a really tough year to be running in. Right. Won his primary, but tough year in a tough state. New Mexico is not an easy state for a Republican. And so that didn't quite work out. And all of a sudden, though, his congressional seat, he came back and beat the guy who had picked it up when he had left to run for the United States Senate. And I can't tell you how thrilled we all were when you did that. I mean, a lot of us, I know you got a lot of telephone calls from people saying, please run, we desperately need you to come back, and you did. So you've entered the majority twice, as a new freshman member, although you, of course, have your seniority and sit on senior committees. I'm very interested in your observation. Number one, why did you do it? I mean, a lot of people would argue, my gosh, Steve, you were sane, you got out of this place, and why in the world did you come back? So, number one, why did you come back? But number two, I'd really be interested in your reflections on the differences between when you were elected in 2002 and now in 2010, particularly this extraordinary freshman class and the national mood that has shaped the election that brought you back to Congress.
Well, first of all, the question about why did I do it? My wife was a little more pointed. When we discussed it, she said, why would you put us through that again? And I figured out that it was going to be the shortest speech I had in my political career. I was going to get 1 to 2 sentences, and if I couldn't convince her, we don't do things apart. And so if I couldn't convince her, we wouldn't run. So I simply told her I'm afraid for the country. She said that's probably the only reason I would have gone along with. She said, let's go and do it. So we got out and we started running, and we're successful. Then when we got here, you saw the wave election that occurred, and that was not partial Tea Party, that was all Tea Party. In other words, people were reading the bills, they were reading the Constitution, and that flavors then this new Congress that we're in. We're here, and people are back home still reading the bills. They're calling me. I got a call last night at about 10:30. This Constitution, you got to keep pushing that, got to keep pushing it. And so the belief in the Tea Party members that we need to be fiscally sound, cut the size of government, quit making promises that we can't keep. Those are basic things to the Tea Party movement. And then finally, that constitutional restraint. And those things are the differences in our. You remember when we got here the first time, it was surely about trying to do the business of the people in a orderly fashion that simply went along with the Republican process. Now then, the process is a lot more jittery. It's not as stable and as pushing forward, which is not a bad deal. I love the fact that we started off with amendments to a spending bill, 700 amendments. Republicans voting for Democrat amendments, Democrats voting for Republican amendments. And that's what our speaker had said. We've become too organized here. It's too much about leadership in every party and just open it up. And my favorite was when Congressman Weiner, who I very rarely agree with, put the bill out, put the amendment out to defund the National Institutes of Peace. Now, National Institutes of Peace, it hasn't worked. Whatever it does, it hasn't worked. There's no peace in the world. And Republicans passed it. Democrats were pushing back, saying don't. And we passed Congressman Weiner's amendment. But those are the things I think are really refreshing.
It is. It is a very different class. Again, when you and I were elected, and we were talking about this before we began to broadcast, 9/11 had happened barely a year before the election that you and I both ran. And the debate over Iraq had taken place in October of 2002, and it really was a sort of war election.
Yes.
What we were going to do, where we were going to go. This is really about a fiscal crisis in the country that is profound. And well, tell me a little bit about this group of unusual people that you're serving with. What are your impressions of them individually or collectively?
They, number one, they all came as individuals, but they were very well schooled. When I showed up, I tell you, I had just run for Congress. I had never even read anything about it. It was not a lifelong dream. It was just me going out. And so this freshman class is here understanding the process they're getting into. They're understanding the ramifications much better than I did as a freshman, and then their constituents are there and reminding them why they're here. Too often, I think we get here and our constituents forget that government by the people. They're happy that it's government of the people, by the people, for the people, but by the people, they really just say go and do it, no more. People are watching every move we're making, and the freshman class reflects that. They're not easy votes on things. That's because people at home are reminding them, I worked to get you there. I expect you to toe the line on some of these tough bills.
Speaking of somebody, obviously, that's looking at it a little bit differently, because you are both know the institution from having served here and are part of this extraordinary group. I think it's done an enormous amount of good for those of us that were here. I mean, it's sort of reconnected a lot of members. If you're not very careful in politics, it's very easy to get jaded and just go along. And this was a message not just with the new people, but it was a message to the old people too.
Right.
That you need to change the way you're doing business up there, and you need to get refocused, and particularly on the fiscal issues. And we're expecting some significant progress. I actually see members that have been here for a while voting more conservatively, and I don't think it's out of, quote, fear. I mean, I think it's actually more out of just being,
it's a reawakening.
Right. It is a reawakening. Yeah. It's been a wonderful, wonderful thing, I think, for the country and the Congress, and puts a special burden on this Congress to actually deliver.
Right.
I remember when you were running, we were chatting on one occasion, and you told me about a conversation you'd had with Speaker Boehner, and as a candidate running again, and of course we'd all tried to recruit you and woo you, and you said, I have a message from the people I'm talking to, is this place needs to be different, not just Republican, it needs to be different from the way it was before. So, and you probably can speak to that more authoritatively than anybody else.
And then Minority Leader Boehner came into the district, and he addressed that, and it was one of the few messages that he could have said as a guy in leadership in New Mexico to calm them down. And he said, look, we've got a rebellion going on in the country, and he said, my job, if I'm Speaker, will be to keep that rebellion alive. In other words, the nation is beginning to rethink many of the things that were just given as they were the givens of our way of governing for the last 40 and 50 years, and now the nation is rethinking that, and I think it's essential that we do rethink it. So I'm finding that rethinking still going on. The old alliances are no longer standing up, not the Democrat alliances, not the Republican alliances. And so there's this playing field that literally is working off of ideas, and that's the reason I have all the optimism in the world for us. We're going to go through some deeply troubling times, but I have the optimism because the American people are rethinking, and they're causing the elected officials to rethink.
Well, again, it's just great to have you here, and I think you make a contribution. You're a sort of bridge between this new group and the existing system, and you've just played a terrific role in mediating and bringing together around core principles. Let me ask you this: you're back on financial services, which is, of course, one of the top committees in Congress, and it was our financial system really that blew apart in the fall of 2008. And there's a lot of innovation coming out of your committee right now, some thoughts about how we need to reshape the financial institutions of the country. What are some of the things you're working on? What do you think some of the big financial challenges the United States has going forward?
Well, first of all, before we get into the financial field, you'd have to look then at the core concepts you're trying to push, and employment, job creation has to be the thing that we push. So then you have to evaluate what are the great obstacles, and we hear the words uncertainty a lot, but the uncertainty is freezing the job market still. That uncertainty is taking place in almost every sector, but when you get to the financial services sector, it's especially apparent. And so jobs, uncertainty, financial services. So we look at how we can improve the uncertainty in financial services. And number one is the regulators are going into the banks and they're threatening them with things that used to be simple write-ups. Now they're saying we're going to give you a $50,000 fine. Before they would say we'll work it out. It's not correct, but we can see you didn't intend harm. Now it's a $50,000 fine, and the bankers are saying, why would we loan money for a house when we got so many pages of exposure and one little error could be $50,000? They said we'll just keep our money and not loan. That's then depressing the jobs in the building industry. It's depressing jobs in real estate. And so you see it percolating out. So creation of certainty is one of the big things. But then you have to look at the things that created instability in the market, and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were some of the big creators. And so we're seeing a whole raft of suggestions, an entire artillery barrage of suggestions on how to curtail the power that the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, these government-sponsored enterprises, the effect they had on the market. So you can break everything down into that, trying to create certainty in the regulatory environment, and also then curb the power of one institution or two institutions to then that deepen the crisis. So let's curb their power.
Do you? What are the ways we would do that with Fannie and Freddie? And do you see them as having an ongoing function, or smaller, granted, but still important? Or, from your perch, is this an area that we really need to basically privatize and get the government out of? How do you see their role in the future? They're doing what, like 90% of the mortgages in the country right now?
A tremendous amount of them. Almost $6 trillion of the mortgages are held by them. The concern among small people, I come from a small state and small banks, and the concern of the small banks is that if you privatize it, you're essentially going to wind up with private firms, the big Wall Street firms, controlling the money and sending it then to where the high rates of return are. In other words, you're never going to get the rate of return on New Mexico property as you get on Wall Street property. Right. Or property here in D.C. It's going to have higher value. It's going to have faster turn rate, faster payoff. Everything is going to say we should make our investment. But small banks located in small towns lend to local small lenders or borrowers, and so that has to stay open. That's something I'm very sensitive to, and Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac have served that purpose. It's just they got way outside that purpose. They began to buy the junk bonds. They began to buy the instruments that they themselves were creating, which were faulty. So I think that we've got to throttle them back. We've got to take a portion of their portfolio away. But I think that their function needs to remain there and valid and viable in order for small states to survive. Otherwise, all of the money will pour into the big states, into the big population areas, be no servicing out in our rural areas that I represent.
Well, I hope you win that fight, because that's exactly the kind of district I represent. It's just dozens and dozens of smaller communities.
Right.
And my bankers tell me very much the same thing, have the same level of concerns. Let me ask you, ever since one thread of consistency in your experiences and certainly in your values, you've always been pretty tough fiscal conservative, pretty tough with a dollar. Where do you see we're at right now in terms of trying to get our hand on both immediate spending and our current continuing resolution battle, which hopefully will be over in the short term, and then longer term, we're going to be rolling out, I think, a pretty aggressive budget, and the only question for me is it going to be aggressive enough in actually beginning to tackle this debt? How do you see that as, number one, how serious a problem is it? Number two, what are the things we ought to be doing to solve it?
Tom, I'm going in with a chart right now, and to every town hall meeting, and many of them they're going to be contentious with me because I represent a 34% Republican district. So they come in with their ears back that we're cutting the size of government too much and it's hurting people. So I go in with my chart, and it just got the number 3.5 T. No zeros, nothing. We spend 3.5 T. Underneath it, I have a line, and underneath the line, 2.2 T. No zeros. People can understand. We spend 3.5. Our revenues are 2.2. And people's eyes fly open, and they say, that won't work. I've done the math. I say I do the math for people like me, but it's 1.3 trillion there. 1.3 trillion in deficit, and people out in the district really don't relate deficit to debt. So I have a little pipeline running from this equation over into this barrel of debt, this accumulated debt since George Washington was president. And so our deficit runs into the debt barrel of 15T, and now people's eyes are really wide open and say it would take a long time to pay 15 with 2.2. They're visualizing their own home finances. If they were spending $3,500 a month, bringing in $2,200 a month. So I have that. At the end of the day, then I say we're in very bad shape fiscally, financially. And so I say, well, okay, you all out here, you wonder if I have made draconian cuts. You heard that accusation. I said we cut 3.5 from 3.5 to 3.44, 60 billion. And I says that draconian. Never has a hand gone up. But also people are saying we got to have that medical care, we got to have this, we got to have more spending. And I'm saying already this is not working. We're looking at fiscal instability, maybe financial collapse. And at that point, people say, okay, we have to work on this before we work on what we want. And we're winning every single town hall because people know we're in fiscal crisis. My point is we can't cut 3.5 deep enough to get to 2.2. We have to grow the jobs. When you put somebody on a job, the 2.2 becomes incrementally more by the taxes they pay. So if you grow jobs, then we quit paying them unemployment, and we quit paying them welfare, and we move them down into the workforce. We increase at 2.2. Creation of jobs is the only thing that's going to fix the fiscal problems we face.
Absolutely true. And it's hard to get that money in off the sidelines that you mentioned earlier. If people think, my goodness, they can't run these deficits forever, they're going to raise my taxes at some point. So
that's the uncertainty. And we're creating the uncertainty because we're saying we might raise your taxes. Cap and trade was a great uncertainty. The healthcare bill, great uncertainty. Ooh, my taxes are going to go up. And so people are hoarding their cash if they're corporations, saying, we better be careful. Individuals began for the first time in over a decade to save money in the U.S. We went from zero savings to 6% in 1 year's period. People are alarmed at what's going on, and they know it can't last, and so they're being very careful. If we would show the right signs here, our economy would burst forward with full growth within days. 30 days when we passed the Bush tax cuts, we went from 1.25% rate of growth to 8.75. 30 days. So it's not like this is some 7-year plan. All we need to do is give the right signals from here.
Well, I think in addition to holding down the spending, providing certainty on the tax front, regulatory relief enormously important. I know you deal with this. You represent a large oil and gas producing district. Yes. And a large agricultural district as well. And I've got a very similar type district. We had Lisa Jackson of the EPA in for a hearing on her budget a couple weeks ago, and I couldn't resist a comment. I said, when I go home, you are the most hated agency in the federal government. Everybody in the oil and gas industry thinks you're going to try and end hydraulic fracturing and shut them down. All my farmers, know that you've got a study underway to look at dust as a pollutant, which, it's hard to farm in southwest Oklahoma without having some dust. And finally, every community I represent, every time they get in compliance on water or whatever, you change it, and all of a sudden they're looking at millions of dollars worth of new sewer equipment, or new wastewater treatment facilities, you name it. You've got to provide, again, a regulatory climate that people can live with and know that if I put money in something, it's going to stay okay for a while.
We see the same thing. In fact, we've decided to take that on. Pair the overregulation with job creation. So I put a bill in that says, look, in the national forest, we lost all of our timber jobs. We used to have 20,000 timber jobs in New Mexico, and we lost them over the spotted owl. So my bill is very simple. It says keep the spotted owl alive in sanctuaries in the forest. We'll leave 1,000 acres here, 1,000 acres there. But let's put people back to work cutting timber. And let's not clear cut while we're at it, because people often accuse us conservatives that we want to clear cut. So let's have balanced thinning programs, create jobs, keep the species alive. That could be 20,000 jobs in New Mexico, which would take us to zero unemployment, would take us all the way from 9% unemployment to zero. That's the sort of thing that I think we have to look at. We've been living with false choices. The choice that we have to keep the species alive or create jobs. We can't do both. The American people are now saying you must do both. You got to figure it out. And so we're submitting suggestions into the Congress right now. Create jobs, keep species alive, protect the environment. But we got to have job growth or nothing works.
Well, you've got another part of your many dimensions, if you will. You obviously served the country with great distinction in the Vietnam era, decorated combat veteran for our country, and I know we're all grateful for that. But you also have been working on a healthy vets bill, I believe. And tell me a little bit about that. That's an area that's got enormous interest in my district.
Again, as one of the veterans, I look at the things that penalize services to veterans. And in our state, much like yours, it's not uncommon to make veterans drive 300 miles to the doctor. So we're saying, look, you pay these people $250 for gasoline to go and see a doctor, then the cost of the doctor. Why don't you just allow the veteran to have half his gas money and go and bargain with a local provider? So instead of giving him $250 for gas money, give him $125 and let him go and bargain, and I will guarantee you any doctor in one of the small towns in New Mexico will see a veteran for $125. They're taking Medicare patients for $15. Surely they'll see a veteran for $100. So give them that money. It doesn't cut back any on the health care, and it saves us from spending lots of useless gasoline. The veterans are getting into their 70s, 80s, and 90s and cannot survive these trips of 5 hours one way, sit there, turn around, 5 hours back. So that's our Healthy Vets bill. Let's take a look at how we can do smarter work with the government money, not just pay more money out.
Well, again, you've got a good background in these issues. Not going to ask you to second guess where we're at and what we're doing, but if you have any thoughts on Libya, I'd be very interested in hearing what they are.
Absolutely. I was in Vietnam as the nation began to really consider itself, so I watched these things very closely. I think that we're asking our young men and women too much to go now into a third conflict. We're having to do repeated TDYs, travel duty. We're fighting the war based here, but fighting a war over there, which means we go for 3 months or 6 months. Our families are dislocated. Families would work better if we sent them over for a year and bring them back for 3 or 4 years, send them back for a year. But instead, it's this constant flow back and forth. It's exactly the way they fought the Vietnam War. It was a mistake then, and it's a mistake now. I've been vocal against this movement into Libya. I don't think that it fits the parameters of the War Powers Act. But more than that, I think it's time for the rest of the world to shoulder the burden, the tax burden, and the military burden with their young men and women at risk and their tax dollars paying for it. The UN passed the no-fly zone. I think the UN, without U.S. troops and without U.S. dollars, should be enforcing it. But instead, we're finding that U.S. dollars are supporting it.
Yeah, to me, there's two different questions here. One of them is the conditions under which we went in. And I have to tell you, I have your same concerns, I suspect, about the constitutionality of what's happened. The way I read the Constitution is pretty clear. If you're going to commit force on this level, you have to come to the Congress of the United States. Secretary Gates, who I suspect, this is just my opinion, he's in the administration and he's going to do that, but I heard him testify in front of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee before we were there, and he clearly had serious doubts about wanting to do this. And he said, remember, an act, if we go to Libya and impose a no-fly zone, that begins with an act of war. And this is a country that has not attacked us. I am no Gaddafi fan. I've met him. I've been there. He is a brutal dictator. On the other hand, he certainly wasn't any friend of al-Qaeda either. We didn't have al-Qaeda operating there. So you make the decision to come and intervene as an act of war, and that's the words of the Secretary of Defense. It seems to me your first obligation is to come to the Congress of the United States. And I think it's also the smart thing to do, in the sense that if you're going to do something like this and it's not popular, I would want as many people having reluctantly agreed to it. And if the will isn't there through the Congress, then we shouldn't be doing it because the American people aren't in favor of it. So we should have had that debate.
We should have had it. And again, I was in Vietnam right at a time when the nation began to choke off the funds into that theater. And I remember training missions here stateside being shut down just to have enough gas to fly the combat missions there. I have anger about a country that would do that, and then I have great concern about a country that is right now an administration that is committing our troops to being out there with maybe the failure to get support from the Congress. I would have disagreed with the president on the intent to go in, but I probably at the end of the day would have supported it if he had come. But now then that he hasn't, I feel compelled as a rule of law. We have a law, and so I feel compelled to be speaking up against it, because in these troubled times, things are very uncertain in the world, very unstable. If the rule of law is not implemented, then we can slide into chaos in the entire world. And so now then we find ourselves in a very, very awkward position nationally, and then I think each one of us. I don't know exactly how it's going to work out. It was a mistake to proceed the way that they did.
There's no clear end game here. Now, we may wake up tomorrow and find that Gaddafi is collapsed or one of his own people have taken him out, but we don't know who the rebels are. We don't really have a clear goal in mind here. I don't think there's a real clear mission other than, in the military sense, we want to try and minimize civilian casualties, and our folks have done that. You give them something to do, they're a pretty remarkable bunch. But I suspect we will be embroiled in this longer and in a more expensive way than we were told up front.
And again, that then makes our deficit worse. Our deficit puts our entire economy at risk. We just need to be making very smart suggestions right now, what to do and how to do it.
Let me ask one other question. We're down to our last couple of minutes here, but you live in a border state. You have a significant Hispanic population, obviously. Be very interested in your thoughts about what we do on the whole immigration border security type issue.
The first thing is that we need to secure our border. It is very dangerous. Secondly, we need to reform legal immigration. We do a lot of immigration work. It takes sometimes 20 years to get an answer if you're trying to come here legally. Many people come here out of frustration and say we could raise our family there and come back home before we get an answer, and so they do. So reform legal immigration and secure the border simultaneously. Then I think the group of immigrants who are here without documentation, we simply ask one question. Do you want to be a citizen? If you do, you got to go get in the back of that line. We can't let you come here illegally to get to the front of the line, or everyone would continue. If you're here and don't want to be a citizen, then get out of the shadows and start paying taxes. I think if people were here as guest workers paying taxes, that the animosity would drop to almost zero. I run that equation by Hispanics in the neighborhood all the time. They're very supportive of it. We're going to continue to talk about that, but we need to cure the border situation.
Now, again, you've got more expertise and more practical experience in this than almost anybody in Congress. Well, we're about to close now, but I just have to say on a personal note, I am really glad you're back, Steve. I've just missed the clarity and the common sense. You'd have been a great United States Senator, but I'm selfishly very glad you're back here with us and help bring the majority back to us.
Thank you.
Just you're one of the really good members. So hope you've enjoyed this particular episode of Cole on Congress. Keep an eye on this guy. He's a voice of reason in a sea of chaos in the Congress of the United States. Steve, good to have you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You bet. Anytime.